Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Japanese planes wreck 8 battleships and kill about 2,400 Americans. Striking the Pacific Fleet in Tokyo, military officials celebrate. They've crippled the U.S. Navy and bought time. They think victory is within reach. But 3 American carriers were absent that morning, operating at sea. Meanwhile, factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle are about to shift into non-stop production. Over the next 4 years, women, immigrants, and retired workers will turn out more aircraft than Japan had ever produced. Japan's leaders believe they've won the opening move. They have no clue what's coming next. Stop for a moment and guess. Could Japan have prevailed in the Pacific, or did December 7, 1941, mark the beginning of their defeat? Hold that thought, you may revise it by the end. If you like history that emphasizes economics and industrial power over just battles, subscribe. To grasp why Japan struck Pearl Harbor, you must first see the trap they faced: an oil crisis. By 1941, Japan had been fighting in China for 4 brutal years, suffering huge casualties with no end in sight while its oil supplies dwindled. About 80% of Japan's oil was imported, much of it from the United States. In July 1941, after Japan moved into French Indochina, President Franklin Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the U.S. Britain and the Dutch government in exile followed suit. The result was essentially a total oil cutoff. Japan's military had maybe 18 months' worth of fuel. After that, the Imperial Navy would be stranded in port and unable to operate. Japan faced a grim choice. It could withdraw from China, sue for terms with the U.S., swallow the humiliation, and probably collapse politically. Or, it could gamble, seize oil in the Dutch East Indies, secure the resources to keep fighting, and hope the risk paid off. The snag was obvious. Any invasion of the Indies would likely provoke American intervention. U.S. forces in the Philippines lay directly along Japan's supply routes. The Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor could attack Japanese convoys. Japan could not grab Southern oil without weakening American power in the Pacific, so they opted to strike first. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet and a Harvard alumnus who had served in Washington, understood both nations well. He knew Japan could not sustain a long war. In 1940, he warned Prime Minister Kano that he could fight hard for 6 months, but had no confidence about a 2 or 3 year conflict. Yamamoto saw the arithmetic. The U.S. had roughly twice the population and an economy many times larger. American steel production dwarfed Japan's STO. Planners hoped a bold opening blow would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet for 6 to 12 months, allowing Japan to overrun the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, the Philippines, Wake, and Guam, and to build a defensive ring across the Pacific. By the time the Americans returned, they'd face fortified positions, stretched logistics, and a seasoned Japanese Navy. The price in American lives would be huge. Americans might tire of the cost, and Japan could keep its gains. This was never about invading the U.S. It was a strategy to make the campaign prohibitively costly for America. It depended on one key assumption: that Americans lacked the will to wage a long, bloody Pacific War. That assumption proved disastrously false. At 6:20 a.m. Hawaiian time on December 7, 1941, the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft launched from 6 carriers about 230 miles north of Oahu. At 7:48 a.m. the assault began. Torpedo planes and dive bombers struck Battleship Row. The USS Arizona's magazine detonated after a bomb penetrated it, blowing the ship apart and killing 1,177 sailors instantly. The USS Oklahoma took 9 torpedoes and rolled over, trapping 429 men. Within 2 hours, 8 battleships were sunk or badly damaged. 188 American aircraft were destroyed, and 2,403 Americans were killed. Japan lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and about 130 men. Tokyo rejoiced. In the short term, it looked like a stunning victory. The battleship force was crippled, and Japan's southern advance seemed unopposed. But crucial things were missing. The 3 U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in Pearl Harbor that morning. Enterprise had been delayed by weather. Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway, and Saratoga was in San Diego. All 3 survived. Equally important, Pearl Harbor's giant fuel tanks remained untouched, and the dry docks and repair facilities that would salvage and rebuild the sunken ships were unscathed. The submarine base remained fully functional, soon to be the platform for the most destructive undersea campaign in history. Japan had sunk ships but left the repair infrastructure that would restore them. Most decisive was the shift in American public opinion. A nation divided about entering the war coalesced overnight. The next day, Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war. The Senate voted 82-0, and the House 388-1. The lone dissenting vote came from Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who had also opposed U.S. entry into World War I. America would not negotiate. America would fight, and that changed the stakes completely. Japan's leaders had misread the crucial question. It wasn't whether their military skill and pilots were impressive, they were. Japanese aviators were among the finest, and the Mitsubishi A6M0 outclassed most American fighters in 1941. The real issue was whether Japan could outproduce the United States. Modern industrial war is decided in factories, not only on the battlefield. Consider the raw numbers. Steel, the backbone of ships, tanks, planes, and in 1941, U.S. mills produced roughly 75 million tons of steel a year. Japan produced about 7 million, a 13-to-1 ratio. In a single month, the U.S. made more steel than Japan did in an entire year. Oil was even more lopsided. The United States pumped over 1 billion barrels annually from Texas, California, Oklahoma, and elsewhere, while Japan had almost no domestic supply and depended on imports. Even after capturing oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, Japan found the wells sabotaged and took months to restore production, and they lacked the tankers to move the oil home, a problem American submarines exploited mercilessly. Population and economy magnified the disparity. The U.S. had about 132 million people versus Japan's 73 million. Roughly double the manpower and workforce, and a far larger economy. Aircraft production tells the story vividly. From 1941 to 1945, American factories rolled out roughly 354,000 aircraft of every type. Japan produced about 76,000 in the same period. In 1944 alone, the U.S. built about 96,000 aircraft, more than Japan managed during the entire war. Japan's peak year produced roughly 28,000 planes. The Americans were producing aircraft at about 3 times Japan's rate every year. Shipbuilding was similarly overwhelming. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States launched about 147 carriers of various classes, fleet, light, and escort carriers, while Japan launched only 18. By 1943, Japan might have had 3 carriers under construction, while American yards were building 22 Essex-class fleet carriers at the same time. In the 3 years after Midway, Japan finished building 6 carriers, while the United States completed 17. And carriers were only part of the story. During the war, America also produced about 2,700 Liberty ships, cargo vessels, transports, and supply ships, averaging roughly 3 new merchant ships every 2 days for 4 straight years. Japan could not keep pace. The gap was enormous. This was not a contest, but an imbalance of historic scale. Japanese strategy relied on a single faith, that Americans would grow weary of the cost and withdraw. That belief had some precedent in Japan's memory after defeating Russia in 1905 at Tsushima. Japan saw a fatigued Tsarist regime negotiate peace despite Russia's larger size and resources. Japan assumed similar exhaustion could sway the United States. That reading of American politics was disastrously wrong. The United States of 1941 was not Tsarist. Russia of 1905. Pearl Harbor united a divided nation. The attack was regarded as treachery, a surprise strike while diplomats were still talking, and Americans demanded retaliation rather than parley, and America had the industrial muscle to deliver it. Japan also miscalculated geopolitically. Its Pacific War wasn't the only theater that mattered. Germany's campaign against the Soviet Union mattered to Tokyo's strategic hopes. If the Soviets fell, Germany might dominate Europe and leave Japan isolated against Britain and the United States. Tokyo needed Germany to occupy or defeat major European opponents. Instead, Germany declared war on the United States for days after Pearl Harbor, dragging the U.S. fully into Europe as well. Critically, American industrial capacity could sustain a two-theater conflict. U.S. strategists prioritized Europe first, defeat the more dangerous Axis power there, then turn resources fully to Japan, and even when facing only a fraction of American resources, Japan still faltered. Midway, June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, marked the turning point. By then, Japan's expansion had been breathtaking. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies had fallen, and an enormous empire existed on maps. But Japan needed to remove the American carrier threat. Yamamoto targeted Midway, about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, aiming to draw U.S. carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them. He assembled the largest naval force Japan had ever gathered. For fleet carriers, hundreds of planes, battleships, and cruisers. The Americans had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea a month earlier, but repair crews rushed her back into action. American codebreakers had decrypted Japanese plans and knew the target and timing. On June 4th, American dive bombers struck and caught 3 Japanese carriers, Kaga and Soryu, with their decks loaded with fueled, armed aircraft. Within minutes, all 3 were ablaze. Later that day, a 4th carrier, Hiryu, was also lost. In a single action, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, the heart of its offensive air power, more than 250 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, Including more than 200 of the most experienced pilots and crew, American losses were comparatively light. Yorktown and one destroyer. Japan never recovered that striking core. Carriers can be built, but veteran aircrews and the institutional knowledge they carry cannot be replaced quickly. This exposes another ruinous gap. Pilot training. At the outset of the war, Japanese naval aviators averaged about 700 flight hours. While American pilots started with roughly 150, that edge and superior aircraft gave Japan an early advantage. But the trend reversed. By mid-1944, newly graduating Japanese pilots had as little as 40 hours, barely enough to take off and land, while American pilots were averaging at least 525 hours. Japan could not replenish its veteran. The United States trained new pilots faster than they were lost. The Battle of the Philippines. In June 1944 illustrated this collapse. As U.S. forces moved on the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Japan launched a huge carrier strike of 9 carriers and over 400 aircraft. American F-6F Hellcats and well-trained pilots decimated the attacking formations in what U.S. aviators called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days, Japan lost more than 600 aircraft, more than its peak annual production. American losses were about 123 aircraft. By then, the U.S. Navy fielded 18 fleet and light carriers in the Pacific to Japan's 9. But the disparity wasn't only numbers. American carriers carried radar. Their aviators had far more hours, and replacements flowed faster than losses. Japanese carriers were staffed with green pilots flying outdated types and had no way to offset casualties. In the final 8 months of the war, the U.S. Navy lost only 2 dive bombers and 5 torpedo planes in aerial combat. The Imperial Japanese Navy persisted as a paper organization, but no longer functioned as an effective fighting force. The core reality is blunt. Japan's strategy required the United States to capitulate, but the United States did not quit wars it had been drawn into, particularly one that began with a surprise attack, killing thousands. Even if Japanese tactics had been flawless, even if Midway had gone another way, the decisive factor was the capacity to replace losses. Japan could not match American industrial throughput. Imagine, for argument's sake, that Japan had destroyed all 3 U.S. carriers at Midway and inflicted heavier casualties. American shipyards would have simply started building replacements. Training programs would have produced new pilots. The counteroffensive would have continued because the industrial foundation backing it was essentially untouchable. Japan's economy was operating at full throttle by 1943. Factories ran non-stop. Civilian manufacturing was pared back to support the military, and still, it was insufficient. The United States, in 1943-44, was fighting across 2 oceans, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union, equipping huge armies, and yet its production kept expanding. By 1945, the U.S. accounted for more than half of global industrial output. Yamamoto understood the limits when he warned that he could expect success for 6 months to a year, at most. After that, the balance favored the United States. Midway came exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Reportedly, Yamamoto spent the day after the attack in a depressed state while others celebrated. He sensed that he had set Japan on a path to defeat, but retreating from China and accepting the oil embargo would have been politically intolerable for Japan's military rulers. So they gambled on American weariness and negotiated peace. That gamble failed not because U.S. soldiers were inherently braver or officers smarter, but because American factories could replace losses much faster than Japan could inflict them. Wars of attrition. Go to the side that can outproduce the opponent. In 1941, that side was the United States by a wide margin. Now I'll ask you, Japan's leaders were aware of the arithmetic and received warnings, yet they attacked. Was Pearl Harbor a rational, desperate gamble, or strategic suicide? Share your thoughts. This isn't merely a World War II debate. It's a lesson about what happens when hope or ideology trumps industrial reality, and when leaders choose conflict despite the odds. Japan attempted an economic war against an opponent capable of replacing 10 tanks for every one Japan built. It was never really a contest. If this shifted how you view history, leave a comment or follow for more analyses.